All right, and welcome back to the next part of the series where we are here talking about metrics with Eric. Eric, in terms of the business and unit metrics, we have been banging on business, business, business. A unit metric is 50% pure business outcomes for that particular price point. It's going to be critical to make sure that you've spoken to the right people. Who have you found that is useful to have input into the metrics? What teams, product leadership, etc. Who do we need at the table?
At the table, you're going to want to have at least a wide understanding of what the metric means. And I'll admit, like at Boomi, it's not as wide as I'd like it to be, but at least from an engineering perspective, if folks understand what a unit cost is and understand how to influence the unit cost, typically you can get some action, especially if you start bringing in efficiency into the equation. But you also want to have your product leaders aligned as well, because the product leaders are the ones that, they own the product at the end of the day. And if the product is not profitable, then they probably would want to know about that. If you have a unit metric that can showcase, not even a unit metric, but just that, well, sure, you could make a revenue to, cost unit metric as well to make sure that it's moving in the right direction, of course. But they want to understand, what the cost of their product is and, how many customers are using it, what the customers are paying to use it, and so on and so forth. And then executive leadership. It's very important to have the executives aligned in what each unit means. So, for example, in the QBR, we have quarterly business reviews with the executives. So in my slide deck, from an operational perspective, I always have the unit costs as well as the history of the unit metrics as well as the history of the unit metrics for them to consume and view.
Awesome. And who may not be there to formulate it, but actually cares and wants to see it? Is there anyone that's not at the table that has the input, but needs to be across it after the fact?
I found that finance and accounting occasionally, they are more concerned with the dollars and the cents of it, but accounting wants to make sure that we're accounting for the right pieces. From like a all-in total cost of ownership perspective, if you have something that's in cost of goods sold from a finance/accounting perspective, you want to make sure that the items that you're allocating the cost of goods sold are actually, servicing your customers or cost of revenue. And sometimes they may take it a step further and also factor in people. How many people do we have supporting this operation that are cost of goods sold? That'll, give you the margins at the end of the day. So finance and accounting definitely want to be informed and understand it as well. Now, when I keep saying end of the day, that's my filler term here. If you haven't noticed already, everybody, you found me out. So where I was going to go with that is having the entire business aligned is important. You want to make sure we're moving in the right direction and are able to track from a margins perspective as well.
Yeah. The next question I had was, who tracks it actively? And I think this is interesting because you've got a FinOps team, you've been in the space, you've got a high degree of capability. So in terms of tracking it, was there anyone that you were surprised? You presented up to your management. Do they really care about it? Is there someone that tracks it that you didn't think would typically track it, or that you're surprised by?
Not necessarily. Well, I take that back. I've had, I guess they're in like sales or partnership folks reach out to me before, wanting to take a look at the unit metrics. I'm more concerned from like a partner perspective. Are we pricing our product right, and are the margins where we need them to be? That's definitely that was a surprise to me. But other than that, like product leaders certainly will reach out and make sure that their product is tracking in the right direction. I would also say that some don't. Right, we're growing, and that is a good thing. And they want to continue to grow. So they're not as concerned with the unit metric, and that's okay too. At some point, right, I would think that they would want to come and take a look back at the unit metric and maybe understand the efficiency of it. But it's fine. All product leaders are different, and ones that are growing substantially may not care as much as ones that are not growing as fast.
And I think, again, what is your business priority? They're going to change over time. Maybe a different
Definitely.
metric will come to focus. So let's not get too worried if our metrics change or don't get focused on too much. We've spoken a bit about the fact that the IT, the builders, we can change half of it. We can change the costs by doing some changes. What about the drivers and the inputs? Who can impact the business side of that? People like marketing, business development, go on sales runs, push more business. Who can impact that business side of the metric?
That's interesting. So you're saying, I believe what you're saying is, if you're tracking what my, cost per customer is, right? And it's impacting how many customers are coming on board. So that would likely be the sales and marketing team going after different markets to bring in different customers, new customers, and of course, sales directly bringing in additional customers as well. So it's not necessarily, from like the numerator perspective, that is going to be your cost. From the denominator, it's going to be the number of, I'm just using this as an example, the customers. And we want to see those customers go up because that greatly will impact your bottom, not your bottom line, but your unit metric. And if you are, from an engineering perspective, responsible for the cost of whatever platform you're running, you can greatly impact that number as well, just by making optimizations. But this is where the business case comes into context. Are you
And have
better
you
off
had,
spending? I was going to say,
so
are you
go,
better off spending your time focusing on bringing in new customers by building new features and functionality, or are you better off making optimizations to the environment to bring down the cost?
and has there been a lot of interaction from those sort of sales marketing people that you've had? Like, okay, all of a sudden we saw our not everything scales perfectly. There could be certain resources or configurations where extra 10 customers give you revenue at no extra cost because there was a bit of unused space. Has there been a lot of active involvement with this sales and marketing into the unit cost, looking at, well, answering why did it drop, why did it peak? Have they been at the table historically?
No, I have never been in a scenario where we've questioned that, at least the unit cost. Where I have been consulted, though, for sure, is on potential new deals where we use the cost data, the unit cost data, to come up with the right pricing structure for a new deal. And we've actually gone live with some of these deals as well. So it's interesting, but no, I typically do not meet with marketing and sales. It's rare, but we have had those conversations before.
And there was definitely certain configurations. If you look at different volumes of usage of a system, if you go from this level of usage to this level, a completely different configuration, completely different set of services and architectures would be more efficient. Do you think there should be more involvement from those sort of pipeline drivers so that you can plan future? Well, if we're going to go to this level of usage, hey, we need to reconfigure this ahead of time so we can actually maintain that unit metric? Or do you just cop it and then retroactively do the fixes when you need to?
So that's a great question, and I like that question because it really gets you thinking about capacity planning a little bit. We have performance, scalability, and reliability teams that do a fair amount about capacity planning and testing to make sure that we're going to be able to host a number of customers within our particular platform. So occasionally we'll get to points where we say, you know what, we are at a spot where we should go higher in a certain instance type or go horizontally and increase a little bit to make sure that we're going to be servicing those customers. But yeah, it's something that we track. I encourage everybody to track as well because you don't want to be stuck with unfortunately, like a system-wide outage, perhaps, because you were not capacity planning and you've had a slow growth of customers.
Yeah. Anyone, if you're watching this at home, YouTube, you can also email us at feedback@finopsfridays.com. If you've got a good example of that where you've actually used and had active engagement from sales or pipeline drivers that could potentially impact your unit metrics and use that proactively, let us know. I'd love to hear where that has been used. How do people get started? Rome wasn't built in a day, and you can't go from zero to hero overnight. You've got to get the people together. We spoke about the people. You've got to have discussions, and you've got to start to build out the metrics. There's an enormous amount of data, of course, so doing this at the cloud scale is always a challenge. a lot of people haven't done the metrics at the cloud scale and also the cloud accuracy. A
Right.
lot to learn and develop. How do you approach it? What would you recommend in terms of your approach to starting to build out these metrics?
First, I would say if you don't have a tagging strategy, come up with a tagging strategy that works for your business. So you can identify what resources are servicing cost of goods sold versus what resources are servicing R&D, because these are two completely different cost items, at least from an accounting perspective. And then once you can identify, what's going where from a R&D perspective versus a cost of goods sold perspective. And I'm thinking about how we operate here, which might be a lot different than a conglomerate, which might have, service lines of like, in the hundreds, right? The tagging strategy for your organization is going to be curtailed to your organization. But once you have the identification in place, you can start to look at, say, how many customers do I have? Or you could say, well, I'm really good at printing or stamping DVDs or something. What does it cost to start printing these DVDs? And then if you can allocate your infrastructure to be able to say, all right, this group services DVDs, this group services another business line, right? You can start coming up with these unit metrics that will start telling a little bit of a business. And I, you know, some of these cloud providers will tell you like to start with, what's your unit cost of like a gigabyte stored or whatnot, right? That's fine. Like at the end of the day, that's going to give you something that you can start tracking from an efficiency perspective. You can say, all right, well, here's my cost to store gigabytes. Here's how many gigabytes I have. Well, great. Now, there is a perfect unit metric that you can use for efficiency. But it depends on your business. But you got to start collecting the data first, and the data sources are important. But if you don't have all the data, you can start small and start working your way up. And that's what I did. I basically started with number of customers that we have, and I knew how much our production platform would cost. So I come up with an easy average cost per customer. Well, that has worked its way into very specific unit metrics that we have here at Boomi.
Yeah, and I like again, you spoke about tagging, which for those at home is applying business information and overlaying business information onto your cost, such as what is the cost center? Is it a production, non-production system? So you could really ask business questions around your costs. Again, business, business, business. Also, for some of our younger viewers, Eric mentioned a DVD. That's these big round black things that are made from vinyl that we used back in the day.
Yeah, right. No, that's a record. DVD. They're all, yeah, I think DVDs are still, no, they're not. It's just
we're showing our wisdom here, I think. Yeah.
Hey, at least I didn't go cassette tape. That would have been pretty bad, but
exactly.
I mean, records still exist in some, they're kind of like nostalgic, I think, but tapes, they're not nostalgic, right? Nobody wants to rewind and fast forward anymore. They flip it around. Yeah, I'm dating myself, sorry.
Yeah. But I do love your point there is to start somewhere. And I think that's a mistake I see a lot of people in terms of metrics. Start broad. Like, what is my total cost? What is my total output? Bang. That's it. You've made that first step. Every journey starts with a single step. Don't try and boil the ocean and measure 20,000 different things. Start with that one and start to come back. Increase your granularity, increase your depth, and then start to look at some different things. What are some of the other metrics, starting at that unit metric at quite a large level? What are some of the other things you typically recommend people stepping through?
So, as I was mentioning before, I said modernity, right? How modern are you? How, I guess, how
things like waste as
wasteful you are. I mean, waste is, it can be also quantified, like what percentage. Now, I don't want, how efficient are you at using your CPU? Can you track that CPU utilization for your platform, for all of your stacks over time to see, am I sitting at 10%, 20%, 30%? You can make that into like a right sizing metric as well if you'd like, if you think it makes sense to start matching your workloads to your demand. I mentioned elasticity before. How well do you grow with client demand and shrink with client demand? Also, are you turning things off on nights and weekends? That's a difficult one for me, because if you have an ever-changing environment in non-production, it's very hard to quantify what is a good state and what is a bad state. But if you use tags to check, to have a schedule to shut things off at certain times, you can see what percentage of infrastructure is tagged versus untagged to have a good understanding. Tagging, right? How tagged are you from a business context? And I say that, are you following your tagging strategy? How well are you tagged following your strategy?
Yeah, percentage of costs that are tagged, untagged, and I always like that. Is it really worth worrying about that last? Law of diminishing returns, getting everything tagged. Well, how much is actually worthwhile tagging? At some point, there's also things like sandpits. Well, is that really an IT cost, or is that a training cost, or it just makes your staff happy they can play with shiny toys? It's a staff retention cost.
Funny, you call it a sandpit. I call it a sandbox.
It's a hole. It's a deep hole it's consuming resources. It's a hole.
Right. Yeah, it's a test bed at the end of the day. Sure.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to take a quick break and go to our mailbag segment. This is where we answer questions from the previous episode of FinOps Fridays. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below or email us at feedback@finopsfridays.com. Over to the mailbag. All right, and welcome to this week's mailbag session. This is where we answer questions and feedback from our previous episode. The episode was with Tiago, looking at the unique properties of the Brazilian FinOps Challenge. A little bit more of a quiet mailbag. Obviously, this one was pretty specific to the Brazilian market, but it was very interesting nonetheless. So the first question, how are you retaining good FinOps talent? Obviously, Brazil was a very, very challenging environment to get talent in. There was nothing really surprising in terms of the answer for this one. It was just, how do you become the best employer? Obviously, you need to make sure in a rapidly changing market that you are keeping up with the competition, making sure that you are a good employer to work at. So all the usual boxes apply there, making sure they've got good, interesting work. Make sure that you really value your FinOps people as well. Just getting them to do menial tasks or getting feedback from them and doing nothing with it. You really have to treasure your employees in a challenging market like this, similar to what you had to do during the Great Resignation. The next question, what are the best practices for forecasting when you have fully managed services, high inflation, interest rates, etc.? We do actually have a episode coming up on forecasting, which should hopefully answer this in a little bit more detail. It really was around the rapid pace and the agility in terms of your forecasting. Obviously, you're not going to be doing quarterly forecasting. It really is making sure that you have the relevant inputs to each and every service, each and every workload that you're using, knowing when to adjust and making sure that you can do those adjustment cycles very, very quickly. Update your models, making sure that they are as accurate as they can be. But the key was really around the speed, the adaptation of those particular models. So that is it for today's mailbag. If you have any feedback or any questions you'd like answered from previous episodes, or you'd like to suggest a topic for us to go a little bit deeper on, you can reach out to us at finopsfridays@aptio.com. Back to the show. All right, and we're back from the mailbag. We're going to end this part of the show. We're going to do a 3-part show because it's quite a good in-depth discussion. So thanks for sticking around. As I said, feedback at finopsfridays.com, or pop us a comment below, and stay tuned for the next part of this episode.